How's it going, guys? In today's video, I want to talk about how moving to another country could change your life. Let's talk. My first experience going to another country was crossing the border from California to Mexico and seeing how differently people lived their life there. They were friendly. Everything was just not quite as neat or orderly as I was used to. And it was just a very different experience hearing people speak a different language. But I was young and it just kind of impacted me a little bit. Fast forward, I was out of high school and some friends got married in Jamaica, man. And again, it was an amazing experience hearing people talk with a very interesting accent, seeing the most beautiful water that I'd ever seen, and again, living around people for a short time that were just so different. I had one really powerful experience when we were at a really nice resort there, and I had one experience that really stood out to me when I was living in Jamaica. I was surrounded by just this idyllic, really just beautiful beach area and everybody smiling and seemingly happy. And when we went to go to grab some lunch one day, we were told that the kitchen was closed. And so later on we found out that the reason why the kitchen was closed was that someone tried to kill themselves. They tried to electrocute themselves inside of the kitchen because they found out that they'd lost their job. And it just really stood out to me. You know, I didn't live in a country where people would normally try to commit suicide because they lost their job. But what I found out is that having a resort job paid really well, and it just really felt like the end of this person's world I could imagine. Still though, being there as a tourist, even though that experience deeply impacted me, even though it was very interesting to be around people from a different culture, still didn't have quite the impact that my life had once I moved to another country. When I was about, I'm so bad with age, but younger 20s, I think around 23, I moved to Australia for what was supposed to be a 6-month trip, and one thing led to another, and that 6-month trip in Australia turned into 10 years of my life. Even still now, a pretty good chunk of my life was spent living in Australia. And this, for the first time for me, was so deeply impacting to live in another culture that I really thought, because it was a Western culture, because they spoke the same language, kinda, was gonna be somehow similar to living in the US. And what I found was that I really couldn't have been more wrong. Australian culture was so deeply different, and how they thought, how they joked around, how people showed affection as friends, and so many other things was just so, I don't know, kind of disconcerting in a lot of ways. For a long time, I just thought everybody in this country hates me. And I learned over time, hey, if people give you a hard time, that means they like you, which is pretty backwards compared to the way people show each other that they like each other in my own culture. So living in Australia really showed me just how people can look at the world in such a different way. And I think that that experience has just made me hungry to learn more and more about other cultures. And there's a few things that I think people really need to understand about other cultures. So when I look at my reflections of living in Australia for a long time, of being around so many immigrants in both Australia and in the US, and again, living now for some years now in another country here in the Philippines, there's really a few things that I think that people don't realize unless they've spent some time living in another culture. The first thing is that if you've always been in your own culture living, I'm not talking about a nice vacation for a week or two or even a month, I'm talking about actually living in another culture, chances are your world is too small. I mean, look at the globe. Try to count how many different countries there are out there. You know, there's a lot. And all of those have radically different cultures, completely different ways of dressing and eating and thinking, such different perspectives on right and wrong, and so much more that goes into culture. If you have only ever lived in your country, your world is just really made up of the experiences that you've had in your own culture. Imagine how big the world is that we live. Not talking about the universe, I'm just talking about the world. You know, there are so many countries out there to explore. And so I just wonder, for those of you that have never lived in another culture, would you ever consider that? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments below. Another thing that I think, if you've never truly lived in another culture, is that your thinking is going to be so narrow. The grid in which we look at the world around us, in which we make decisions, in which we produce emotions and thoughts and, different feelings of what's right and wrong, whether we realize it or not, is so deeply culturally impacted. Sure, within our own cultures, there's so much diversity and different ways of thinking and living and, acting, but they're still all part of that kind of map of our world inside of our own country. You really truly have to live in another place, and you have to do that for years until you're able to finally start to see things through the eyes of people in another culture. Once that happens, your perspective will not be quite as narrow, and it really expands the way that you see that other people can start to think. So many of the things that you think are problems are in your own mind. Problems are really very cultural. The things that people think are a problem in my own country of the US, for example, are quite different than what people here in the Philippines think are problems. Sure, we share some things in common with that, but we really look at problems and what's even a problem to begin with super differently. Live around other people for long enough and you'll start to see that what you look at as a problem is something they don't even take notice of, and the reverse is likely true. What they see of as problems might be a little bit confusing to you. And lastly, I think living in another culture for a long enough time helps you to see that ethics are not always as black and white as we might think. There's a lot of things that we just think are simply wrong or right that people in other places don't look at that way. I think that we really see, even in our limited experience living in our own, countries, that people do things for so many different reasons. And yes, some things truly are black and white, no matter where you are in the world. But the decision-making processes that a lot of people have, depending on where they live, depending on what they're going through, leads them to quite different conclusions at times with what is right or wrong. So I could imagine some of you watching this video and just saying, come on, this video is, you just telling us that we are, somehow deficient or missing out or less than. And listen, that's not my motivation here at all and not what I think. But I do want to say that if you've never thought about living in another country for a time, why not consider it? The world truly has so much to offer. And I hear again, some of you saying, I haven't traveled in my own country, I'd want to start there. But again, you just can't compare to the experience of living in another culture, traveling there, truly living around other people. And I mention this more than anything because I think that our lives can be so enriched by truly taking time to step in other people's shoes, live where they live, eat where they live, think as they think. Life could really be so much more rich and meaningful. As always, guys, love to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comment below. And as always, thanks for taking the time to watch. Take care.